Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's Learn at Lunch webinar. We will hear from Dr. David Lallman, our Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. If you have questions during the presentation, you may ask them through the chat window by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentation, you may also unmute yourselves to ask questions. For more information on this and other farm management topics, visit the farm management page. I will share the link in the chat window. We have our next webinar scheduled on ag taxes for March 12th at noon. And so, Dr. Lallman, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Brent. Hope my voice holds out. I'm not sure why, but I've been a little hoarse the last day or two. Okay, well, Brent said normally you all are join the webinar or meeting for around 20 to 30 minutes. So we'll try to keep it to that today. This is a topic that, gosh, we could spend, several days on actually, but we'll try to hit the highlights and share some resources with you that might help you with your clients. And I think our primary goal will be to, show you kind of the fundamentals of nutrition or what the type of information we need to give you and your clients or beef cattle producers confidence in their nutritional management decisions. I think that's our primary goal because these are all science-based principles, and there are a lot of things out there on the market with all kinds of claims, and it's very difficult to sort through those if you don't have a good grasp of these fundamental principles. And so that's what I want to do, just kind of lay the foundation, guide you to some resources that are available, and then we can kind of go from there. All right, so let's just do a real quick review of recent financial analysis of cow-calf operations. This particular data set comes from the Kansas Farm Management Association. And what I want you to see here is the 2022 pasture cost, feed cost, and I just added those two categories together for a total. I used 2022 because the Kansas Farm Management Association has not posted their 2023 results yet. I also checked, Brent, I checked the FinBin results this morning. They have not posted their 2023, farm management, or beef cow calf enterprise results yet either. So I just went ahead and used 2022. We'll be comparing that to the previous 5 years. And, simply what I want to show you is that, yes, pasture costs have gone up a little bit, about 7% in 2022, but feed costs jumped dramatically in 2022. And it stayed that way, I can tell you, through 2023 and here early in 2024. The one thing that has changed quite a bit from beginning about maybe late last fall was hay prices. If producers had to purchase hay, it was terribly expensive in 2022 and throughout that winter. But last fall, of course, we finally received enough summer and fall rain that we grew more forage to replenish that inventory, and hay prices began to soften a little bit. Nevertheless, feed prices are the big culprit of the increase in those total costs. And the $619 represents right at 50% of both direct and indirect costs in a cow-calf operation. And this is from about, as I recall, about 69 different ranches there in Kansas during 2022. The Minnesota program, the FinBin program, in 2022 evaluated 138 herds from different states. And their average feed plus pasture cost was right at $575. So just to give you an idea of what you might consider kind of an average pasture and feed cost in operations here, at least through this southern and northern Great Plains. Okay, so since it's such an important part of the budget, I think it represents an area where there's and has really my entire career, but it has only gotten more increased emphasis because of the continual increase in operating costs. But it does represent an opportunity and explains a good bit, by the way, of the differences between highly profitable and the lowest 1/3. If we break them into 3 different groups, highly profitable, moderate, and low profitability groups of those different ranches, feed costs are almost always the number one variable in terms of explaining that profitability. Producers with high profit almost always do a better job in terms of minimizing their production costs, particularly their feed cost. Okay, so here's kind of the basis of what I want to share with you in terms of those fundamental principles. We're not going to talk much about matching cattle to forage and the management system. That's really important one, but takes some time to work through that. But yeah, that's going to be a big part of it. If that is not balanced, the cattle and the forage management system, let's say, let me just give you a real quick example. A mismatch might be a commercial cow-calf producer that's calving in the middle. There are times of the breeding season to calve in the middle of January, and has selected cows with, let's say, breed leading milk yield or purchased herd sires with breed leading milk yield, breed leading yearling weight growth, and actually breed leading, which probably going to lead to breed leading feed intake, genetic prediction tools, expected progeny differences, or EPDs. Okay, so if you're calving in the middle of January and spring calving, right? And you have selected for extreme production or performance over time, that is generally going to result in a really large feed bill, obviously, because those animals are going to be at the peak of their nutrient requirements when standing forage quality is at its lowest quality. And so they'll have to feed a lot of supplement or provide a lot of hay to replace forage, and therefore leading to an expensive feed bill. That's a pretty big mismatch, and that's what we're talking about there. Okay, so then body condition is another principle that's been proven over time. I spent a lot of time in my PhD program several years ago at the University of Missouri working on that question. And I'll just show you real quick some fundamentals about body condition and why we can't, or how we can use it to kind of evaluate, well, for one thing, the match of the cattle to the forage and the management system for sure, but also supplementation needs and how effective the supplementation program is. Finally, diet evaluation. It's a pretty simple process. Yes, it takes some homework to accomplish the simple process. But if you have a forage nutritive value in a forage-based system, where cattle are turned out grazing, if you have nutritive values from that forage system, and if you know about what the animal's requirements are, you can do a diet evaluation. Those are the 2 pieces of information that are required. We just compare one to the other, and there'll be either a pretty good match. There'll be a big gap, in other words, meaning their supply is far below their requirements, or there may be an excess meaning we could probably back off or save some money in some areas. Okay, and then finally, observation and common sense. Well, observation has, I guess, would be directly related, for one thing, to the body condition scoring item above. Certainly, if your cows come in, let's say, a body condition score 4 at weaning, year after year, it's probably an indication of a mismatch in the management system and or the genetics of the cattle. So because we'd like for them to come in, or at least enter the winter in a spring calving system, enter winter in at least a body condition score 5 and try to maintain them there. Okay, so let's just talk just a minute about body condition score. And really what we're talking about here is energy reserves reflected in the body composition of those cows. Fat tissue is very dense stored energy. When a cow gains weight, let's say if she starts in moderate condition, she's gaining weight, she gains mostly fat and some muscle tissue, protein tissue, which is muscle and organs. When she's losing weight from say a body condition 5 or average condition, she's losing considerable amount of fat and a little bit of protein tissue. The thinner she gets, the less fat there is to lose, and therefore weight loss comes from primarily protein and organ tissue. That's when they really get thin. When cows are really fat, weight gain comes from mostly fat tissue because muscles and organs are maximized. They don't just keep growing. Eventually they get to their greatest mass, if you will, and then any weight gain from there on is just fat tissue. So that's kind of how that works. The literature over time clearly indicates that the body condition score that cows are in the day they calve is probably the most important time of year to evaluate that. And that body condition score at that time has the greatest impact on reproductive performance, okay? Their ability to get bred back this upcoming breeding season. So the common sense target we've shared with, I see my extension colleagues on here today, but we've shared with producers for many years, is to try to calve cows in a minimum body condition score of about 5. And we'll hedge our bet with 2-year-old heifers and try to calve them in at least a body condition score 6, because those 2-year-old heifers are going to have somewhere between 30 to 60 day longer postpartum interval before they begin to cycle compared to a mature cow. And so if we calve them a little better body condition, we can speed that postpartum interval up just a bit. Okay, now the challenge is requirements of cows vary throughout the year, their production cycle. Obviously, when they calve and begin milk production, their nutrient requirements are at the highest of the entire production cycle. On the opposite end of that, when we wean those calves and milk production is discontinued or she dries up, the next couple of months there, or the second or third trimester, I guess, second trimester, middle of gestation, with no lactation represents the time period when her nutrient requirements are at the lowest, because the fetus is still relatively small, she's not producing milk. And so that's the time when it's easiest to make up ground in terms of body condition, because her nutrient requirements are low. Okay, now the other side of that is the forage base. Especially if you're talking about standing forage and not harvested forage. Well, standing forage quality is going to be changing. It's a moving target, much like the cow's requirements are a moving target. And so that's what makes this exercise, or comparing requirements to supply, a challenge, is because kind of both ends of the equation are moving all the time. But still, we can do a pretty good job of that, especially, now that, we've studied this for several years, we have better tools available now than we had 10 or even 20 years ago. So here's how we determine an effective supplementation program. It's very straightforward and simple. I encourage people to, seek out their extension personnel, and this is something that our extension group works on extensively. I see some of our area livestock specialists on the Zoom today, and they're experts at this process you see right here. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, we need to determine the nutrient requirements of the animal. Next, estimate the nutrients that are available from the forage base. And generally speaking, that's going to take some homework, but it is doable. And if you continue to gather that information over time, just like most things we do in agriculture, if you develop your own database or your own library, it becomes extremely valuable information as time goes by, and it gets better and better as you continue to add to that database. With number 1 and 2, we can accomplish number 3, and that's just comparing one to the other and see if we have a gap or an excess. And the last step in that process is to do the evaluation. A lot of people will call myself or Marty or Britt, or I see Lauren on there. They'll call and want to start with number 4, right? Evaluate the supplement alternatives. Well, then we have to start asking questions about 1 and 2. What type of cattle are they? What stage of production are they in? And then obviously ask questions about the forage base and what else they might be doing from a nutritional standpoint. So we have to accomplish 1 and 2, get to 3, and then finally evaluate the supplement alternatives. Okay, so we'll talk a little more about that, but right now I just wanted to suggest that one resource available to accomplish those steps is the OSU calculator. Earl Ward also has a real nice, very simple, easy to use Excel spreadsheet to evaluate supplementation for cows. And I'd encourage you to look it up. Both of these products are available at beef.okstate.edu, our website there. Okay, so other resources available. If you are not, you probably have some clients, maybe a lot of clients that aren't comfortable with a computer. We can still accomplish that. So with the nutrient requirements, estimates of those are available in tabular form. So, and those tables are available in the Beef Cattle Manual, which you see a picture of here. You can also order that online. You can just Google the OSU Beef Cattle Manual, or you can go to beef.okstate.edu and find it there. Next, we have extension bulletins with both nutrient requirements, those same tables available, as well as nutritive value of feeds, which is this showing you here, this extension bulletin 3018, which is exactly that. This is the front page here on this slide, but those tables are available in the other pages of that particular bulletin. Of course, those values are also available in tabular form in the Beef Cattle Manual. The problem with tabular values, especially in terms of nutrients available in those forages, is that it is a moving target, and it's going to be different from farm to farm. It will be different from year to year. And so those tabular values are at least a place to start, but you'd be much better off having your own forage analyzed, or having your clients analyze their forage. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in our system now, here at OSU, our forage, our laboratory charges around 12. If you add the minerals to that, maybe as much as $18 for an analysis. But it is not terribly expensive, and we have much better resources or access to those laboratory analysis at reasonable cost than we did 20 years ago. That has gotten much better. It just doesn't cost that much to gather this information to do a good job of diet evaluation in beef cattle. Another good way, and I think probably most people ought to try to do, especially if this is an important enterprise in their agricultural, business, is to build your own library. We've got the calculator nutrition evaluation program built to where you can change all of the feeds in the feed library. And the idea is for someone to, let's say if we're talking about feeding hay, they would send off a lot or harvest group of hay sample, get it analyzed, type in the values they get back from the laboratory, and go from there. That way, they're not relying on a tabular value that may or may not reflect their own forage composition. Consistency and continuity over time is key. We've been analyzing data from our about 3 large prairie hay meadows now for well over 25 years. And I can tell you very closely what our copper concentration, what our selenium concentration is going to be, about how much variability we'll have from year to year in protein or energy in that hay source, because we've been watching it, tracking it for a long time. And you can do the same thing in your pastures. I encourage people, especially when it comes to mineral nutrition, to think about maybe doing a survey of forage. Let's maybe just pick one pasture to start off with and collect hand-plucked samples, okay? So you go out there and you pluck the better quality material, the leafier material that you think the cows will be grazing. Certainly it helps to watch them graze to make sure that's the case. And then dry and forward those samples to the laboratory, or forward them. I guess you don't have to dry them ahead of time, but you would need to send them off to the laboratory and have that data analyzed. And then, gosh, if you really would like to, you can do that on a quarterly basis, or maybe even do it on a monthly basis. And again, eventually develop a valuable resource that not too many people have available to minimize your feed costs, because you'll know what you need to supplement and how much you need to test. People ask, where can I find those laboratories that are commercial laboratories available? This is the website that you can go to look for certified laboratories. They have to pass a test every year to stay on that list. And those are the laboratories that we recommend, because they have proven that their information is accurate according to that test. Okay, determine supplemental needs. Once again, that's pretty simple math. It's if you know the nutrients from the forage supplies, you subtract the nutrient requirements, so you're going to wind up with either a pretty good balance, an excess, or deficiency. And that's what we're trying to find out. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about priorities here. So, first of all, overfeeding any nutrient is unnecessary and expensive. So yes, we want to meet their requirements, but we don't want to be overfeeding, because that's what is costly. On the opposite side of that, ignoring a substantial deficiency can be devastating. Let's say you have a copper deficiency for 7 or 8 years in a row in a cow herd, where those cows are staying on your place for that long of a time period. You could eventually wind up with a very low copper status in those cows, which leads to reproductive challenges, leads to lower immunity, certainly in their calves, so on and so forth. Okay, so we think in most cases in Oklahoma, the first thing you need to do in a nutrient evaluation or a diet evaluation is to address the protein balance first. That's the place to start, and I'll show you why here in just a second. Then, once you're confident that the forage base, if it provides adequate protein, or your forage base plus supplement is adequate in terms of protein, then next you evaluate the energy balance. Are you satisfied with the projected performance or weight gain of those animals? If it's a set of cows, you want to make sure that they're not projected to lose a full body condition score in a month or in 2 months, right? Because we want them to calve in good condition. Then the third thing we'll do is evaluate the cost and the convenience. Fourth thing would be convenience. So once we get 1 and 2 accomplished, then we can start looking at alternatives that might be preferential due to lower costs or greater convenience. Okay, here's this is a study one of my students did when I hadn't been here at OSU for very long. But we just fed 2 pounds of it, what wound up being about a 38%, I think this says 40% protein supplement or cube, to a set of cows grazing native range. These were spring calving cows. We fed them that either no supplement at all, with abundant standing native forage available, or 2 pounds per day of that 38% cube. Okay, and look at the difference in performance. The cows consuming 2 pounds just to fill that protein gap gained 23 pounds. The cows that were not supplemented at all, were consuming forage that was about 3 to 4% protein, lost 153 pounds in 90 days. They lost 1.6 body condition scores, whereas, the cows consuming 2 pounds of the 38 still lost a little body condition. Remember, the cow weight change in that 2 pounds of supplemented group is primarily due to fetal growth, right? And so she's actually gaining weight, but losing body condition. And that's what's going on there. And you can see from the weaning weights that year, it resulted in about, or the not filling that protein gap resulted in about 40 pounds of lower weaning weight as well. So it can be costly, and that's why we think that is the number one thing that should be prioritized. And not that protein should be overfed, and there's quite a bit of information available to show that overfeeding protein does not make things better. Meeting the requirement does. Overfeeding protein does not further improve performance. Just a couple things about protein sources. We'll wrap it up here. Natural or plant protein sources, you see here listed quite a few common protein sources that we use here in the state of Oklahoma. And those are provided in a lot of the commercial products that you see. A lot of the cube products are made with the blend of wheat middlings and cottonseed meal. Both of those two products make a nice cube. More recently, we've seen the development of cubes or pellets made out of dried distillers grains, and that seems to be working well also. Previously, we didn't have the technology to make a good quality cube out of a product that has as much fat as dried distillers grains has, but we've kind of overcome that, and you see more of that product available. But dried distillers would be included in this natural or plant protein list here. And then we get a lot of questions about non-protein nitrogen sources. So the rumen needs urea. The bugs in the rumen need not urea, they need ammonia to convert that nitrogen to propagate and basically build more microbial tissue that's flushed into the acidic environment there in the small intestine, where they are digested, and the amino acids from those actual that microbial population is actually what the cow uses to meet most of her protein requirements. But those microbes need that rumen ammonia. And those can come from the natural protein or plant protein sources, or it can be provided through urea, biuret, or ammonium sulfate and some of these other convenience-based products, or molasses-based products. A lot of questions about how well those two different sources work over time. Still get quite a few of those questions. And what I want you to see here, this is a nice literature review that was done some time back, but looking at a good number of experiments, and you see there the average forage crude protein concentration is 3.7 to about 4.5. Of course, we think that, as I showed earlier, that the minimum protein requirement to help that rumen stay optimally functional, some say around 7%, 7.5%. We hedge our bet. We just use the 8% number to make sure that we have adequate protein or ammonia in the rumen for those microbes to optimize fermentation. But you can see that in these experiments, this was low quality forage, and they definitely had a protein gap there at 3.7 to 4.5, and they need 8, right? So they need a considerable amount more protein to make that up. Average increase in feed intake from these two products, yes, the non-protein nitrogen product did increase feed intake in this literature review by a little over 30%. The natural sources increased it more. So you got a better benefit probably from the delayed release of that nitrogen from a natural protein source. Big range in response in both cases, more narrow and maybe on average a little bit more positive over here in the natural protein sources. Long story short, if you're using a non-protein nitrogen source with really low quality forage, you're certainly going to have to be able to use it multiple or make it available to the animals more frequently, because that ammonia source is utilized and disappears, or else it's metabolized very rapidly. Whereas you have a more consistent supply of nitrogen or ammonia in the rumen with a natural protein source. Anytime we've compared to in a low quality grazing forage situation, natural to urea in a dry supplement like a cube that's fed once a day or once every third day, something like that, the natural sources always shine. And the other thing I'll say is that you don't want to try to be using something that's primarily urea based when you have a really wide protein gap. So like 3 or 4% protein with a 10 or 11% protein requirement, like a lactating cow would be. Okay, there are some things you can do to increase NPN utilization. I've already mentioned some of these, but basically young cattle don't utilize non-protein nitrogen very well. Anytime you're using a urea or non-protein nitrogen source as a protein. Now, I mean, I probably should have said when I started, we're talking about non-protein nitrogen here because it's inexpensive. It's almost always much less expensive than a natural or plant-based protein source. And that's why this comes up. And when feed prices really get high, we get more questions about it. And that's certainly logical. But anytime you're feeding a little bit of fermentable carbohydrate, concentrate feed, something like wheat midds or rolled corn, or even soybean hulls or something like that, you get increased utilization of the non-protein nitrogen compared if if there's no supplement of fermentable carbohydrate, you're not going to get as good a utilization. Just helps those bugs to capture more of that or balance the ammonia supply along with the fermentable carbohydrate supply. Anytime dietary protein is marginally deficient, the non-protein nitrogen products seem to work reasonably well and probably better than they do if you have a really wide protein gap, like I mentioned earlier. 4% forage versus 11% lactating cow requirement. That's a big gap. And we wouldn't expect the NPN sources to work very well or fit very well in that case. Anytime you blend natural and non-protein nitrogen, well, I mean, what you're doing there is just providing more natural protein that has a slower ammonia release rate, okay? And so you're kind of diluting the NPN, if you will. And anytime you use an NPN product, the more time a day it's available, like in a poured or cooked molasses block or in a lick tank or something like that, where the cows can go back to it multiple times a day. Yes, generally you do get improved non-protein nitrogen utilization. At the end of the day, only you can decide. Generally those convenience-based, non-protein nitrogen-based products are going to be more expensive per unit of protein. And so you have to decide what that convenience is worth and do your own math and see if it's going to be beneficial at the end of the day. Real quick comment here. A lot of people, continue to be interested in interval feeding because it reduces the labor requirement. Most folks, especially when those cows are dry and not yet calving, can go check their cattle 2 or 3 times a week instead of daily. And so you could provide a feed or supplement, let's say 3 times a week is a very common practice, and it works very well. The literature indicates, the research suggests that 3 times a week, as long as you're not trying to feed too much, 3 times a week works very well and is just about produces the same animal performance as feeding it daily. Now you can overdo it. We've had cases where, let's say if a person has 1,200-pound cows and they want to feed up to 8 to 10 pounds per day on a daily basis. So, you divide that, if you're gonna feed that by 3 days a week, so 10 pounds a day. Let's take the extreme example, times 7 days. That's 70 pounds in a week. And you divide that by 3 and you've got what, 23 70 pounds. Here, let me get my math out right quick. Not very good on the fly. 70 pounds divided by 3 times a week is, yeah, sure enough. I thought in my head that can't be right, but no, it's 23 pounds per feeding, okay? And you should know without having to think twice, that's a bad idea. You'll wind up with founder. We think that each feeding should be around, we don't have data to document what the ideal or maximum interval feeding rate is, but we think probably it's somewhere around 1% of body weight per feeding. So in a 1,200-pound cow, 12 pounds per feeding. Okay, and if you're doing it 3 times a week, that means you've got a maximum delivery of about 36 pounds of feed in that week. So just kind of some guidelines that you can use to go about that. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up, and it looks like we got a few questions there, but I want to encourage you to download either the calculator program or the beef cow supplementation program provided by Earl there from our website, beef.okstate.edu, and work with your extension educators to try to work out, a diet evaluation for those cattle and try to minimize those feed costs. Be glad, Brent, to try to answer any questions if there are already.
Excellent. I have it set where people can unmute themselves to ask questions, or that you may ask your questions to the chat as well. I shared links to the beef calculator fact sheet that Dr. Ullman mentioned, as well as the foragetesting.org website.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, Brent, or,
Neither am I. So I did share a link to our webinar survey in the chat room for everyone to fill out and give us a little evaluation feedback. Also, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Lallman. Our next webinar will be March 12th at noon. Extension Farm Tax Specialist J.C. Hobbs will discuss what's happening with ag taxes. So I hope to see you there. I'm going to end the webinar now, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us.